McLaren, not Mercedes, has started the Japanese Grand Prix weekend on the front foot, but given this is kind of how it happened a couple of weeks ago at the season opener, it's actually what they're doing that's a lot more interesting than just being P1. So John Noble, we dug into the data, we found something very interesting, very surprising. What was the difference between Oscar Piastri's P1 lap in FP2 and Kimi Antonelli in the best of the Mercedes?
Yeah, this is a fascinating example because McLaren has been chasing Mercedes in terms of optimising deployment. It's been a running theme over the first races, and you would have thought the way to do it would be to do exactly the same as Mercedes are doing, cotton on to their tricks and what they're doing. But actually, the data, as you can see here, they're doing something very different around Suzuka. The lap times end up almost identical, but how they're achieving it is completely different. They're using deployment in two different areas of the track. McLaren is deploying coming out of the chicane, so down the straight. Piastri hits a peak of 328 kilometres an hour. The Mercs are much more conservative. I mean, George Russell's lap, for example, he only hit 305, so big speed difference. It puts McLaren half a second up coming into the S's section. Then things narrow down a bit, and by the time they get to the hairpin, 0.2 seconds of difference. Then they run around, and then we come out of the spoon curve where Mercedes deploys, and there's a big speed difference there. Piastri is at 320, and Antonelli was up at 330 kilometres an hour. They hit their peak before dropping down for a speed difference of about 10 kilometres an hour. It means Mercedes are actually ahead when they come into the chicane, but then as they come out to deploy again, Mercedes puts it on the power and gets that fine bit of difference. So they're achieving almost identical lap times, but done in very different ways, which is fascinating because it opens up what could be quite a good tactical battle over the weekend.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because there are little details within this that mean inevitably what we've seen on FP2 in FP2 isn't going to be what we see in qualifying. If you look at George Russell's lap, for example, the fact that he wasn't getting the deployment intended off the final corner at the very end of the lap means that there's a little bit of time being lost there. I think he said it was costing him 2 or 3 tenths to Antonelli, for example. Now, I don't know whether George is factoring in the lap time he would have gained earlier in the lap when he was maybe deploying maybe where Antonelli couldn't, I'm not sure. But it's interesting because it means that, yes, there's obviously some more headroom for Mercedes to move into, but the fact we have such a point of difference when, generally speaking, there's been reasonable convergence over the first couple of weekends. We saw, if you go back to Australia in the season opener, there was loads of difference in FP1, but as the weekend goes on, everyone realises what's the most sensible way of doing this. But the fact that we have this distinction between the two, it sets things up nicely, because if this continues into the race, then that's going to be not just a performance differentiator over one lap, it's going to mean that there are opportunities for McLaren to be annoying.
Yeah, we know the races and the shuffling around, the yo-yo racing has relied on different manufacturers and different teams doing different deployment tactics. And if we end up in a scenario here where McLaren is using its power in one place and Mercedes in another, that will lead to overtakes. The question will then be who can break free, basically, to build up that 1 second gap to get out of the overtake activation. So if Piastri can get ahead, if he can then deploy in the right places, potentially he has the pace to do it. But I think there is one big caveat with this, which you've mentioned about changing track conditions. And we have to dig into the details of George Russell's lap, because he was hitting a recharge limit. We discussed yesterday how FIA pulled back the recharge limit over a lap in qualifying to 8 megajoules. And basically what he was experiencing today was he hit that 8 megajoule limit and then couldn't recharge anymore. So no ability to recharge anymore, no ability to deploy anymore. So basically was running out of this power. Now as the track ramps up, you will find that the drivers are braking later into the hairpin, maybe 10 metres or so. And the quick corners, turn 1 for example, into the Degners, even Spoon, will be taken much quicker. So there'll be less harvesting, which actually sounds counterintuitive, but by less harvesting, you'll hit your recharge limit later in the lap. And then therefore, where George Russell has been lacking today in hitting that recharge limit, he'll hit it much later, and that could result in more lap time.
And that Russell recharge limit was being hit earlier today because of a driving style difference. So he was getting some advice through spoon curve, turns 13 and 14 here, before that long back straight before 130R. Clearly what Russell was doing in there meant that he was just charging a little bit more than Antonelli was, and therefore wasn't able to do that later around the lap. And I think that's what gives you that crucial little bit of extra battery that you can then spend off of the final corner. So how that evolves over FP3 and qualifying will be interesting for qualifying. Then there's obviously the race situation itself. I don't think anything from today has left McLaren thinking that it's genuinely a Mercedes threat in just pure pace terms. The long runs still very much favour Mercedes, but it's more about kind of being, and we're going to talk about Ferrari in a minute, but it's being in that kind of Ferrari spoiler role, isn't it? Just being a bit of a nuisance.
Yeah, Charles Leclerc talked yesterday about the ability of Ferrari to annoy Mercedes. They can't beat them, but they can annoy them. And when you annoy them, there's the potential for mistakes. And I think McLaren's got itself in a window where the long run pace isn't there. If we base it today, Kimi's long run was about 34.78. Piastri's was 35.92. But he was trapped in traffic for a bit. And if you counter that out, you end up at about a 35.25. So it's half a second adrift.
It's still there. It's still that gap, isn't it?
The gap is there. Ferrari was on a 35.44, so there's still this decent jump to Mercedes, but it's about overtaking could be difficult here. If you're deploying in different places, you could manage to get in front and cause trouble and limit the advantage. So there are differences there. But I think it's also interesting that McLaren has clearly got an approach of wanting to do things differently. It's the only team that's kept two hards back so far as well. So it's given them strategic options in the race if there's a safety car, for example. So maybe it knows that right now it doesn't have the car to beat Mercedes wheel to wheel, but it can cause trouble, it can annoy, it can do things differently, and maybe that opens the door for opportunity.
It's potentially the first manifestation this weekend of what Andrea Stella, the team principal at McLaren, has been saying for a while and reiterated in today's press conference, that he believes that this is a car with a lot of potential. It's just they've been underperforming. They obviously didn't start with either car in China. So it might be that we start to see the real McLaren for the first time properly this weekend. It is only one McLaren that's had a smooth day. Piastri's looked really comfortable. Norris held back by a hydraulic leak of some kind and was very unhappy. I spoke to him after FP2. He feels that he's 2 or 3 steps behind and had a pretty terrible start to the weekend. But just on McLaren being in this position, obviously, if they really are the nearest threat to Mercedes here, they're not going to have that key Ferrari advantage off the line with the mega starts that we've seen the last couple of races. So it's interesting because Ferrari right now doesn't look to be in the same place that it's been in the first couple of weekends. So what McLaren might do might be on deployment or whatever, however it can get track position a different way. As it stands, Ferrari is looking like a row 3 car, so taking the lead, I mean, it's a long run to turn 1 here, that would be asking a lot, but why does Ferrari look like it's third best rather than second best for a change?
Yeah, I think the McLaren potential is there, but we also must remember that McLaren does not have that Ferrari start advantage, and it's even worse than that because Oscar Piastri hasn't done a race start this year. So we know the complications on the starts. We know there's the recharge limit on formation laps that caught drivers out. You need to learn and understand where to recharge to get your brakes warm, where to do your burnouts to get your tyres ready. So it's going to be a tough ask. But Ferrari doesn't seem to be in as comfortable a place with its car here this weekend. Lewis talked about not being, especially at 1, the pace is a little bit off. But equally, its long run pace, from McLaren's prediction in particular, is that it's still the main threat to Mercedes. And it does have this start advantage. And we've seen it in all races so far that the Ferrari can push forwards. And if it can do that again, there's no reason to suggest we won't see the annoyances that Leclerc does. And if we get McLaren in that mix too, the annoyance for Mercedes could be extreme.
There's one obvious top team or usual top team that we haven't mentioned so far, and that's Red Bull, because Red Bull is very much looking like a midfield team again here, like it was in China. Spoke to Max Verstappen and Paul Monahan after FP2, neither hiding the fact that it's been a difficult day. Monahan's explanation basically boiled down to there are a lot of corners here, especially sector 1, and their car's not very good around corners at the moment. So there's a lot of work for them to do. The upgrade package that they brought here does seem to have worked. Monahan said that's the thing that's behaving perfectly fine. It's just the car balance isn't there. Max talks about it shifting from one extreme to the other. So he's not very happy, and he kind of shrugged off the reality of Suzuka here as well. I expected him to be one of the more negative voices, given what we've seen with, we saw the horrendous super clipping into 130R and what team drivers are having to do into the Degners, for example. It's just been underwhelming. But Max basically said like that, this isn't our biggest problem. He's still very much upset with the car. But what did you make of the challenge or lack thereof of Suzuka in F1 2026 cars? Because the drivers were They were trying not to be too negative. I think that was a bit of an effort today, but it's very clear that they're not satisfied with what F1 2026 has done to such a legendary track.
Yeah, I think it's a difficult circuit because you haven't got the heavy braking zones, you haven't got the high speed into low speed corners that are good for these cars, and there's long straights where you need the deployment and it simply isn't there, and you can't do it. It's a track that doesn't suit perfectly this generation of cars, especially in qualifying. But we saw in Melbourne, for example, that a very complicated and disappointing aspect of cars in qualifying can manifest itself in a bit more of a crazier battling on Sunday. Whether that's good or bad, I think still depends on your opinion of what these rules are like. But I think we're going to need to see the full extent of the picture, both tomorrow and Sunday, to judge, is this a track that isn't going to work unless there's a big change to the rules?
I think there is agreement that this 8 megajoule limit for qualifying has helped there over one lap. What you're seeing here, because of the way that the rules work, is basically the cars super clip massively into turns 1 and 2. So they're not running the MG UK at all through the sweeps of the first sector. Super clip again into the Degnas, super clip again into Spoon, then no MG UK through Spoon, no MG UK through the Degnas either. So yeah, I think you're kind of seeing the worst of the engines again, a bit like we saw in Melbourne, but maybe more pronounced, because in Melbourne it was only really like 1 or 2 places really that you saw it, and here it's kind of 3 or 4, and they're legendary corners attached to them as well, which has been a bit of a disappointment. Maybe to end on a sort of paraphrasing of what Carlos Sainz told me after FP2, he said it's not a disaster, but it's still not really F1.